one of the big disadvantages of speaking at the end of the day is that not only has everybody pretty much said what you were kind of groping towards saying, but they've said it so much better. But the plus is, I hope that means that I can sort of junk some things that have already been said many times and be as brief as possible. On the Trump announcement, there isn't much new to say. I just mentioned, because I had to unavoidably miss the second session, so maybe it was said in that, but we've talked about the Christian evangelical Christian constituency that Trump was appeasing with this, and Daniel talked very eloquently about the sort of various elements of the new republicanism. I think it's also worth mentioning Sheldon Adelson. I'm not saying that he was necessarily the prime motivator for Trump doing that, but he has been agitating for the movement of the embassy for a very long time. He was Trump's biggest single donor in the campaign, and until very recently, at least, he was a great friend of Netanyahu's. I mean, I won't bore you with why he may have fallen out with Netanyahu, but I can assure you it is not from a liberal position. He, of course, has financed the very pervasive free newspaper Israel Hayom, which is a tremendous cheerleader of the right in Israel. So I think it's not impossible. And he's also, amazingly, offered to finance the embassy, an idea which, even some of the most ardent right-wing nationalists in Israel find a little bit dodgy. But anyway, so I think it's fair to say that the Trump announcement did, apart from, really confounding any hope of a peace negotiation, and I share all Daniel's and others' doubts about the possibility that existed before Trump came in of a successful negotiation. But he also, in a sense, did seek to bury a legacy of over 70 years. And I know we're here very much talking about the purpose of this session is to talk about the occupation since 1967. But if you live in Jerusalem, as I did as a correspondent for 8 years, you can't really escape the legacy of 1948 as well. And I mean, a couple of things flash into my mind at this point. You can go to the street which is now Palmach, going through Talbieh. You can see exactly where Count Bernadotte was assassinated on the orders of Shamir, then running Lehi, and that the hopes that he had of internationalizing the city, well, I accept all the doubts about whether it should have been internationalized, but it was, at least he was, I think, an honest mediator, and he was shot down in that very brutal way in a street that you can still see. The other thing that flashes through my mind from that period is going with Dr. Ghada Kami, who spoke so beautifully this morning about her experience as a child living in Jerusalem as an Arab city, and I had this kind of bittersweet experience of going with her to the very house in Casamon where she lived until the age of 12, I think. Sorry, 8, 9. Okay. No, sorry. That's true. And now, then and now, actually inhabited, or at least the upper floor that was built onto it after 48 by the New York Times, as it happens. But also, it's impossible to escape the effect of the occupation. And I just want to mention a few of the things that form the sort of bread and butter of journalistic life in Jerusalem. Relentless growth of settlements. I've covered a lot of, I've experienced quite a lot of the building of settlements in Silwan and other parts of really what is inner city Jerusalem, and got to know Ataret Kohanim quite well, the very, very ferociously nationalistic people who really will stop at nothing to get rid of Palestinian settlements, get rid of Palestinians from what they conceived to be convenient future settlements. The wall, the building of the wall, which happened throughout that period, Dr. Munir has talked very eloquently about the removal of IDs. I just paused just to back up what he said. I remember I covered stories about this, and I remember one particular case which stuck in my mind, which was that of a Jerusalemite. His parents, all his family was still in Jerusalem. I went to see his father, who had a shop in Saladin, and he was engaged, he was a PhD, working in the United States. As it happened, he was working in a sort of semi-academic industry interface on some very important defense work. And he had the highest level of US security clearance. And he was about to have his East Jerusalem ID, I guess on Centre of Life grounds, taken away from him. And I remember how distraught his father was at the idea that this would happen. I mean, you just think about it. I'm a Londoner. My son goes to spend, I don't know, 6 years in the United States, and he finds that he can't come back to his native city. I mean, that's what we're really talking about. And so I think that is actually a very apposite thing to have raised. I just also very quickly want to digress, and I know I only have 5 minutes, to just say something about UNRWA. I know it's not immediately relevant, although of course there are refugees in Shufat, and it's not irrelevant to Jerusalem, but it's slightly off the main point. I think there's a misconception there. As Daniel said, this really is a crisis. And actually, it's not just a matter of 65 million. Normally, these payments are made in tranches. And what Trump has done is only pay 60 million, true, of a first tranche, but he has given absolutely no guarantee, as the US usually do, that they will pay another 2 tranches. And I do not think that it's elaborate, a kind of fantasy to think that he is in the early stages of trying to take the refugee issue and the right of return off the table, as he has boasted he's taken Jerusalem off the table. Sorry, that's a digression. Anyway, I will speed up. I just want to say 2 things very quickly. One is that perhaps at the end of the day, it's worth just not being completely pessimistic. And I think one wants at this point to pay tribute a little bit to the extraordinary steadfastness, actually, of East Jerusalem Palestinians since 1967, despite all the kind of onslaughts and assaults on their position. Assaults, by the way, which are frequently chronicled in the secret but usually leaked reports of the EU's heads of mission. Every year they produce quite a good document saying just how serious the pressures on East Jerusalem Palestinians are. And I'm afraid that those reports tend to gather dust. And occasionally they produce minimal results, but they do not have the galvanizing effect on European EU policy towards Jerusalem that I believe even most of the heads of mission would like them to. So, but what I'm really trying to say is that I think, there have been, and Nir Hasson, a journalist I very much admire on Haaretz, wrote a very good piece on this subject recently. And Dr. Tibi referred to the very successful mobilization. I'm not trying to be Panglossian about this. Things are very, very difficult and in many respects getting worse. Nonetheless, the actions, the mobilization, for example, against the use of security cameras on Haram al-Sharif was a pretty impressive mobilization. And, I think also of all those people who continue to build houses, which are absolutely necessary if you're going to stay in Jerusalem, in defiance of Israeli building regulations, knowing that they could be pulled down. This is in itself also a kind of steadfastness and sumud, which is extremely important. But I do want to just conclude by I was going to ask this anyway, and being very, very provocative, if you like, because I know this is very controversial, but Daniel mentioned it, and I also wanted to mention, a recent opinion poll did actually show that a majority of East, how reliable it is, I cannot say, but it was reported as having said that a majority of East Jerusalem Palestinians now would ideally prefer to vote in municipal elections. Now, this does open up an absolute hornet's nest. There will be people saying immediately that that's normalization, that it's accepting the illegal and recognized internationally as illegal annexation of East Jerusalem, so-called annexation, unilateral annexation, that it is the beginning of the end of accepting the occupation. But there is, I think, another way of looking at it, and I'm not arguing one case or the other. I'm just saying I think this is an important matter for debate. In other words, is it a kind of act of normalization, or does it actually have the potential to represent the intifada of the ballot box? And I would really like to hear some opinions on that. I think I've said enough now.